Linn had always been different from the other Omegas in his pack. While they focused on traditional skills like cooking and nurturing, Linn found himself drawn to books, to healing herbs, to quiet contemplation under starlit skies. His gift was rare and powerful, an empathic ability that allowed him to feel the emotions of others, to understand their pain and joy as if it were his own. But in a pack that valued physical strength above all else, this sensitivity was seen as weakness, this gentleness as fragility. For 21 years, Linn had lived quietly in the shadow of his pack, helping where he could, learning what he was allowed, and waiting for the ceremony that would change everything, the night when fated mates would finally bond for eternity. The pack elders spoke of it in reverent tones, this sacred moment when the moon goddess herself would reveal the connections that bound souls together across time and space. Kale, son of the pack leader, was everything an alpha was supposed to be. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that caught the firelight and eyes like winter storms. He commanded respect through presence alone. The pack looked to him for leadership, for strength, for the future of their bloodline. He was ambitious, calculating, cold in the way that alphas were taught to be cold, never showing weakness, never revealing vulnerability, never allowing emotion to cloud judgment. For months, Linn had felt the pull growing stronger, the invisible thread that connected fated mates drawing him inexorably toward Kale. In quiet moments, when the alpha's guard was down, Linn caught glimpses of something softer beneath the harsh exterior, a loneliness that mirrored his own, a yearning for connection that went deeper than pack politics and power plays. He allowed himself to hope, to dream of a future where his gentleness would be valued, where his gifts would be appreciated, where he would finally belong somewhere completely. The night of the ceremony arrived with the full moon hanging like a silver coin in the star-scattered sky. The great bonfire crackled in the center of their sacred grove, its flames reaching toward the heavens as if carrying the prayers and hopes of all gathered there. Around the fire, dozens of unmated wolves had assembled, their excitement and nervousness creating a symphony of emotions that only Linn could truly hear. The elder raised his staff, and the gathered wolves fell silent. His voice carried across the clearing with the weight of centuries of tradition. Tonight, under the blessing of the full moon, those called by fate will step forward and claim their eternal bonds. Let no one stand between what the moon goddess has decreed. Linn's heart hammered against his ribs as he felt the pull intensify, the connection to Kale becoming so strong it was almost visible, like silver threads stretching between them in the moonlight. This was it. This was the moment he had dreamed of since he first understood what it meant to have a fated mate. He took a step forward, then another, his bare feet silent on the soft earth. Around the circle, other wolves were moving too, drawn to their destined partners by forces older than memory. Kale's eyes found his across the fire, and for a moment, just a moment, Linn saw something flicker there. Recognition, perhaps, maybe even tenderness. The silver thread of their bond became visible in the moonlight, stretching between them like spun starlight. Linn reached out his hand, fingers trembling not with fear but with anticipation. After years of waiting, of hoping, of believing that someday he would find his place in the world, that moment had finally arrived. He could feel Kale's emotions through their strengthening bond, confusion, desire, conflict, and beneath it all, a longing that matched his own. But then everything shattered. I will not bind myself to an Omega who trembles at every gust of wind. Kale's voice boomed across the grove, loud enough for every wolf present to hear. The words hit Linn like physical blows, each one more devastating than the last. The tender moment they had shared just seconds before might never have existed, erased by the cold mask that had descended over the alpha's features. The pack needs strength, not silence, Kale continued, his voice carrying the authority of his bloodline, the weight of his father's expectations. I reject this bond. The world seemed to slow as Linn watched Kale reach up and grasp the silver thread that connected them. His face was hard, emotionless, as if the connection between them meant nothing, as if Linn himself meant nothing. With one sharp motion, he tore the bond apart and cast the broken pieces into the fire. The pain was indescribable. It felt like someone had reached into Linn's chest and ripped out half his soul, leaving jagged edges that burned with every breath. Through his gift, he could hear the shock and pity of the gathered pack, their emotions crashing over him in waves. Some whispered among themselves, others stared openly at his humiliation. The other bonding pairs continued their ceremonies as if nothing had happened, but Linn stood frozen in the center of it all, broken and bleeding inside. Linn. The elder's voice was gentle, but underneath it, Linn could hear the disappointment, the resignation. Return to your place. The moon goddess works in mysterious ways. Somehow, Linn managed to move his feet, to step back from the fire and fade into the shadows at the edge of the grove. He watched as Kale stood tall and proud, unmarked by what he had just done. While Linn felt like he was dying from the inside out, the ceremony continued around him, but he was no longer part of it. He was nothing, a rejected Omega, a failed mate, an embarrassment to his pack. The days that followed were a blur of shame and isolation. Word of his rejection spread through the pack like wildfire, and everywhere he went, Linn felt the weight of their judgment. The pack council met in emergency session to discuss what to do with him. An Omega without a mate, especially one who had been publicly rejected, was seen as unstable, potentially dangerous. You bring dishonor to our bloodline, his pack leader told him bluntly. Your presence reminds everyone of weakness, of failure. Perhaps it would be better if you found somewhere else to live. They took away his family name first. He was no longer Linn of the Dark Ridge Pack, he was just Linn, unaffiliated, unwanted. Then they came for his dwelling, the small cabin on the outskirts of pack territory that had been his sanctuary. He watched from a distance as they set it ablaze, the flames consuming everything he owned, every memory of the life he had built. The other Omegas who had once been his friends now crossed the street to avoid him. They feared that association with a rejected mate would bring them bad luck, would mark them as undesirable to potential alphas. The alphas were worse. Some mocked him openly, while others looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust that made his skin crawl. Maybe if you had been stronger, one of them said as Linn passed by the training grounds. Maybe if you had fought for what you wanted instead of just standing there like a wounded deer. But what was he supposed to have done? Forced Kale to accept a bond he didn't want? Begged him to reconsider while the entire pack watched? The laws of fated mates were clear. Both parties had to willingly accept the bond. He couldn't make Kale want him, couldn't force love where there was only disdain. After a week of this treatment, Linn made the only choice he had left. In the dark hours before dawn, he gathered the few possessions they hadn't burned and slipped away from pack territory. He headed for the borderlands, the wild places where exiles and outcasts went when they had nowhere else to turn. The journey was harder than he had expected. Without the protection of the pack, without access to the healing magic that bound their community together, his body began to fail. The rejection had left wounds that went deeper than physical pain. His wolf spirit was dying, slowly and inexorably, like a flower cut from its roots. He found shelter in an abandoned cave on the first night, using his remaining supplies to build a small fire. As he sat staring into the flames, he thought about Kale's words, about the contempt in his voice, about the way the pack had so easily discarded him. Was he really so weak, so worthless, that even his fated mate couldn't bear the thought of being bound to him? Days passed in a haze of hunger and exhaustion. Linn survived on roots and stream water, his clothes growing loose as his body consumed itself. The empathic abilities that had once been his gift now felt like a curse, allowing him to sense the fear and hostility of every creature he encountered. Even the forest animals seemed to recognize him as something broken, something that didn't belong. It was during his second week of exile that Linn's strength finally gave out. He had been trying to reach a stream he could hear in the distance when his legs simply stopped obeying him. He collapsed on a bed of fallen leaves, his vision blurring as his body finally surrendered to the inevitable. This was how it would end, he thought with a strange sense of peace. Alone, forgotten, fading away like he had never existed at all. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. When consciousness returned, Linn found himself in a place he had never seen before. The stone walls around him were ancient, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering candlelight. Tapestries hung from the walls, depicting scenes of battles and ceremonies from ages past. The air smelled of old books and burning incense, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of wind whistling through high towers. "Ah, you're awake." The voice came from the shadows near the doorway, cultured and precise, with an accent that spoke of old nobility and older secrets. A figure stepped into the light, and Linn's breath caught in his throat. The man was tall and lean, with pale skin that seemed to glow in the candlelight and dark hair that fell in waves to his shoulders. His eyes were the color of aged wine, and when he smiled, Linn caught a glimpse of fangs that marked him as something other than human. A vampire. Linn had heard stories of them, ancient creatures who lived in the spaces between the mortal world and the realm of the dead. They were supposed to be monsters, predators who fed on the life force of others. But this one had saved him. "I am Valmaris," the vampire said, moving with fluid grace to check the fire in the hearth. "And you, little wolf, are very lucky to be alive. Another hour and I would have been too late to help you." "Why?" Linn's voice came out as barely a whisper, his throat raw from disuse. "Why did you save me?" Valmaris paused in his ministrations, those wine-dark eyes studying Linn with an intensity that made him feel both vulnerable and strangely protected. "Curiosity, perhaps. It's been a long time since I've encountered a creature so thoroughly abandoned by his own kind. I wanted to see if you had the strength to survive it. And if I don't? Then you don't," Valmaris replied simply. "But I suspect you're stronger than you think." Linn of the Dark Ridge Pack. The use of his full name, spoken without mockery or pity, brought tears to Linn's eyes. When was the last time someone had called him by his true name? When was the last time anyone had looked at him without disgust or dismissal? "They cast me out," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "My fated mate rejected me in front of the entire pack. They said I was too weak, too soft, that I brought shame to our bloodline." Valmaris was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, touched with something that might have been understanding. "I know something about rejection," he said, "about being cast out by those who should have protected you. My own kind exiled me centuries ago for refusing to follow their increasingly brutal customs. I've lived alone in this fortress ever since, watching the world change while I remain unchanged. Then why help me? Why not let me die in the forest?" "Because," Valmaris said, settling into a chair beside the bed, "loneliness is a burden that becomes lighter when shared, even temporarily. You may stay here as long as you need to heal. In return, I ask only for your company, someone to talk to who understands what it means to be unwanted." And so began the strangest chapter of Linn's life. The fortress of Ister was a place caught between worlds, its ancient stones holding memories of both glory and tragedy. Valmaris had lived there for over 3 centuries, preserving knowledge that would otherwise be lost, maintaining a library that contained wisdom from dozens of different cultures and species. At first, Linn was merely a guest, a curiosity that Valmaris had rescued on a whim. But as the days passed, something began to change between them. The vampire was nothing like the monsters from the stories. He was cultured, intelligent, possessed of a dry wit that made Linn laugh despite his pain. More importantly, he never spoke to Linn with condescension or pity. He treated him as an equal, as someone whose thoughts and opinions mattered. "You have an interesting perspective on healing magic," Valmaris observed one evening as they worked together in his laboratory, mixing herbs and potions for the sick animals that sometimes found their way to the fortress. "Your pack's traditions are quite different from what I learned in my youth." "My pack never valued my knowledge," Linn replied, carefully measuring out dried moonflower petals. "They thought healing was women's work, that an omega male who knew about herbs was somehow less than those who focused on traditional pursuits." "Their loss," Valmaris said simply, "and my gain. I haven't had a proper conversation about botanical medicine in decades." These moments of easy companionship were a revelation to Linn. For the first time in his life, he felt truly seen, truly valued for who he was rather than what others expected him to be. Valmaris never asked him to be stronger or harder or more traditionally masculine. He accepted Linn's gentleness as a strength, his empathy as a gift, his intelligence as something to be cultivated rather than hidden. Weeks turned into months, and Linn found himself looking forward to their conversations, to the quiet moments they shared in the library or the garden. Valmaris was teaching him things the pack had never allowed him to learn: swordplay, defensive magic, the history of the supernatural world beyond the borders of werewolf territory. "Why are you doing this?" Linn asked one evening as they practiced combat forms in the fortress courtyard. "Teaching me to fight, to defend myself?" "Because," Valmaris said, adjusting Linn's grip on the practice sword, "you deserve to feel safe in your own skin. You deserve to know that you can protect yourself and those you care about." The casual way he said, "those you care about," made Linn's heart skip a beat. Did that include Valmaris himself? Had they moved beyond mere companionship into something deeper, something that neither of them had dared to name? It was during one of their sparring sessions that everything changed. Linn had been practicing a particularly difficult defensive sequence when he stumbled, his balance thrown off by fatigue. Valmaris caught him before he could fall. Their bodies pressed close together, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. "Are you all right?" Valmaris asked, his voice softer than usual. Linn looked up into those wine-dark eyes and saw something there that made his breath catch. Not pity, not mere concern, but something warmer, something that spoke of deeper feelings carefully held in check. "I'm fine," he whispered, but neither of them moved apart. The kiss, when it came, was gentle and tentative, as if Valmaris was afraid of frightening him away. But Linn had never felt safer than he did in that moment, wrapped in the arms of someone who saw him as precious rather than broken. "I'm sorry," Valmaris said, pulling back slightly. "I shouldn't have." "Yes, you should have," Linn interrupted, his hands fisting in the vampire's shirt. "I've been hoping you would." What followed was a conversation that lasted long into the night, both of them finally giving voice to feelings they had been harboring for months. Valmaris spoke of centuries of loneliness, of watching the world change while remaining forever apart from it. Linn shared his dreams of belonging somewhere, of being valued for who he was rather than what others expected him to be. "I can't offer you what a traditional mate would," Valmaris said, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on Linn's skin. "I'm not immortal, I'm not human, I'm not even fully alive by most definitions. A relationship with me would be complicated, potentially dangerous. I'm an exiled Omega with empathic abilities who was rejected by his own kind," Linn replied, pressing closer to the vampire's cool embrace. "I think I can handle complicated." Their relationship deepened over the following weeks, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection that neither of them had experienced before. Valmaris was a patient and generous lover, taking time to show Linn pleasures he had never imagined, while Linn brought warmth and life to chambers that had been cold and empty for far too long. But their peaceful existence was disrupted one autumn morning when a small, frightened voice called out from the forest beyond the fortress walls. "Please, someone help me. My mama is hurt." Linn rushed outside to find a young werewolf pup, no more than 7 years old, trembling with fear and exhaustion. The child was clearly of mixed heritage. His wolf form was smaller than usual, his scent carrying traces of something other than pure werewolf blood. "Where is your mother?" Linn asked gently, kneeling down to the pup's level. "She's by the old oak tree," the child sobbed. "She told me to run, to find help, but I don't know where to go. The pack, they said we couldn't come back, that half-breeds weren't welcome anymore." Linn's heart broke for the child, remembering all too well what it felt like to be cast out, to have nowhere to turn. He scooped the pup into his arms and called for Valmaris, and together they rushed into the forest to find the child's mother. They found her collapsed at the base of a massive oak tree, her breathing shallow and labored. She was clearly dying, her body unable to cope with the stress of exile and the harsh conditions of life in the wild. When she saw them approach, she tried to struggle to her feet, her maternal instincts overriding her own pain. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Take care of Rua. He's a good boy. He doesn't deserve to suffer for what I am. You're not going to die, Linn said firmly, but even as he spoke, he could feel her life force ebbing away. His empathic abilities told him everything he needed to know. She had been holding on through sheer force of will, waiting for someone to find her son. Promise me, she insisted, her eyes finding Linn's with desperate intensity. Promise me you'll love him like your own. I promise, Linn said, and meant it completely. She died holding her son's hand, peaceful at last in the knowledge that he would be cared for. Linn held the sobbing pup while Valmaris built a funeral pyre, both of them understanding without words that their family had just grown by one. Rua was a remarkable child, intelligent, curious, and possessed of an inner strength that reminded Linn of himself at that age. Despite his mixed heritage, or perhaps because of it, he had an adaptability that served him well in his new environment. Within days, he was calling Linn Papa and following Valmaris around like a devoted shadow. We have a son, Valmaris observed one evening as they watched Rua play in the garden, his small form darting between the flower beds with childish enthusiasm. We do, Linn agreed, feeling a completeness he had never experienced before. Is that all right with you? More than all right, Valmaris replied, pulling Linn close. I never thought I would have a family. I never thought I deserved one. We all deserve love, Linn said softly. It just sometimes takes a while to find it. For 2 years, they lived in peaceful contentment. Linn continued to grow stronger, both physically and emotionally, while Valmaris discovered the joys of fatherhood. Rua thrived under their care, his unique heritage allowing him to learn from both werewolf and vampire traditions. The fortress became a true home, filled with laughter and love and the countless small moments that make a family. But their happiness was shattered one winter morning when a familiar scent reached Linn's sensitive nose. Pack wolves, and lots of them, approaching the fortress with hostile intent. They've found us, he told Valmaris, his voice tight with tension. How many? The vampire asked, already moving to secure the fortress defenses. At least 20, Linn replied, his empathic abilities painting a clear picture of the approaching threat. And they're angry. They're not here to talk. The delegation from the Dark Ridge Pack was led by Kale himself, now fully grown into his role as Alpha. He had filled out in the years since Linn's exile, his shoulders broader, his presence more commanding. But his eyes held the same cold dismissal they always had, the same certainty that he was right and everyone else was wrong. So this is where the traitor has been hiding, Kale said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with alpha authority. Living in luxury while his former pack struggles to maintain their standing among the other clans. I'm not a traitor, Linn replied, stepping forward to face his former mate. I'm someone who was cast out and found a new life. That's not the same thing. You consort with vampires, another pack member spat. You've corrupted yourself beyond redemption. I found love and acceptance, Linn corrected. Something I never had within the pack. Kale's expression darkened at the mention of love, and for a moment, Linn thought he saw something flicker in those winter storm eyes. Jealousy, perhaps, or regret. But it was gone so quickly that he might have imagined it. You belong to the pack, Kale said. An Omega without a pack is an abomination, a creature without purpose or place. We've come to bring you home. This is my home, Linn replied firmly. These are my family. I'm not going anywhere. Then we'll take you by force, Kale snarled, his control finally slipping. And we'll deal with your vampire protector and that half-breed brat while we're at it. The threat to Rua was the final straw. Linn felt something snap inside him, a protective rage that was stronger than anything he had ever experienced. This was his child, his family, his home, and he would defend them with his life if necessary. You will not touch them, he said, his voice carrying a power that made even the Alpha Pack members step back. They are under my protection. Your protection? Kale laughed harshly. You're still the same weak Omega you always were. What protection could you possibly offer? But as the words left his mouth, something extraordinary happened. The air around Linn began to shimmer with energy, his empathic abilities expanding and intensifying in response to his emotional state. For the first time in his life, instead of just receiving emotions, he began to project them. Waves of protective fury washed over the attacking wolves, followed by images of the love and acceptance he had found in his new life. They felt his pain at being rejected, his joy at finding Valmaris, his fierce devotion to Ruah. The emotional assault was so intense that several of the pack members fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the sudden influx of foreign feelings. "What is this?" Kale gasped, his own mental defenses struggling against the onslaught. "This is what you threw away," Linn replied, his voice echoing with newfound power. "This is what you could have had if you hadn't been so afraid of appearing weak." Through the emotional connection, Kale experienced everything Linn had felt during their failed bonding ceremony. The hope, the love, the desperate desire to be accepted and valued. He felt the crushing pain of rejection, the slow healing that had come through Valmaris's care, and the fierce protective love that now drove Linn to defend his chosen family. "I was protecting the pack," Kale said, but his voice lacked its former certainty. "You were protecting your image," Linn corrected. "You were so afraid of what others would think if you bonded with someone they saw as weak that you threw away your true mate. And for what? To maintain a reputation built on fear and intimidation." Around them, the battle had evolved into something far more complex than simple violence. Valmaris and his defensive magic held the fortress against the attacking wolves, while Ruah used his mixed heritage to confuse and disorient their enemies. But it was Linn's emotional projections that were truly turning the tide, forcing the pack members to confront their own fears and prejudices. "You don't understand," Kale said, his alpha composure cracking. "The expectations, the pressure, the constant need to be strong for everyone else. I couldn't afford to appear weak." "And how has that worked out for you?" Linn asked, genuinely curious. Through their renewed connection, he could feel Kale's loneliness, his regret, his growing realization that he had made a terrible mistake. "I've been miserable," Kale admitted, the words torn from him by the emotional honesty that Linn's abilities demanded. "Every day I wonder what might have been if I had been brave enough to accept our bond. But it's too late now. You've moved on, found someone who can give you what I couldn't." "I have," Linn agreed, "and I'm happier than I ever thought possible. But that doesn't mean I hate you, Kale. I pity you." The words hit the alpha like a physical blow, and for a moment, his carefully constructed facade crumbled completely. Here was the man Linn had sometimes glimpsed beneath the cold exterior, vulnerable, lonely, trapped by expectations he had never questioned. "I don't want your pity," Kale said, but there was no heat in it. "Then earn something better," Linn replied. "Go home. Learn to be the kind of leader who lifts others up instead of tearing them down. Find your own happiness instead of trying to destroy mine." The battle ended not with violence but with understanding. One by one, the pack members laid down their weapons, their minds cleared by the emotional truths Linn had forced them to confront. They saw him not as a traitor or an abomination, but as someone who had found the strength to build a new life from the ashes of his old one. "We should go," Kale said finally, his voice heavy with defeat and recognition. "We have no place here." "No," Linn agreed, "but you do have a place somewhere. You just have to be brave enough to find it." As the pack departed, Linn felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. The past was truly behind him now, its hold on his heart finally broken. He was free to embrace the future he had chosen, the family he had built, the love he had found. "Are you all right?" Valmaris asked, wrapping his arms around Linn from behind. "I'm perfect," Linn replied, leaning back into his mate's embrace. "For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I belong." Ruah ran up to them, his young face bright with excitement and pride. "Papa, you were amazing. You were so strong and brave." "We all were," Linn said, scooping the boy into his arms. "That's what families do. We protect each other." "Always?" Ruah asked. "Always," Valmaris confirmed, his hand resting gently on the child's head. "No matter what." As the sun set over the fortress of Ister, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the three of them stood together in the courtyard, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. They were an unusual family by any standard: an exiled Omega werewolf, an ancient vampire, and a mixed heritage pup, but they were bound together by something stronger than blood or tradition. "I used to think that being rejected was the worst thing that could happen to me," Linn said quietly. "But now I realize it was the best thing. If Kale hadn't rejected me, I never would have found you. I never would have learned what real love feels like." "The moon goddess works in mysterious ways," Valmaris said with a smile, echoing the elder's words from that fateful night so long ago. "She does indeed," Linn agreed. "And sometimes her greatest gifts come disguised as our greatest losses." In the months that followed, their story spread throughout the supernatural community. Other outcasts and exiles began to find their way to the fortress, seeking the acceptance and understanding that Linn and Valmaris offered freely. The fortress became a haven for those who didn't fit into traditional categories, a place where love was more important than bloodlines, where family was defined by choice rather than genetics. Ruah grew into a confident young man, his mixed heritage allowing him to serve as a bridge between different supernatural communities. He learned werewolf traditions from Linn and vampire lore from Valmaris, becoming something entirely new, a hybrid who embodied the best of both worlds. "Will you tell me the story again?" he asked one evening as they sat by the fire, now old enough to understand the full significance of his adoptive parents' journey. "Which story?" Linn asked, though he already knew the answer. "The story of how you found each other," Ruah said. "The story of how our family began." And so Linn told it again, the tale of rejection and redemption, of love found in the most unexpected places, of a family built not on blood or obligation, but on choice and commitment. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down to future generations who might need to know that sometimes the ending you think you want isn't the one you actually need. "The most important thing to remember," Linn said as he finished the tale, "is that you always have a choice. You can let rejection define you, or you can use it as the first step toward finding something better. You can accept the limitations others place on you, or you can discover your own strength. You can remain alone, or you can choose to love and be loved in return." "And if someone rejects you?" Ruah asked. "Then you thank them for showing you their true character," Valmaris replied. "And you keep looking for the people who will see your worth. Like you saw Papa's worth?" "Exactly like that," Valmaris confirmed, his hand finding Linn's in the firelight. "Sometimes the most precious things come to us broken, and it's only through love and patience that we discover their true beauty." As the fire burned low and the night grew quiet around them, the three members of their unlikely family settled into comfortable silence. Outside, the wind whispered through the ancient stones of the fortress, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. Linn had found his place in the world at last, not as someone's rejected mate or someone's burden, but as himself, fully and completely. He was a father, a partner, a healer, a bridge between worlds. He was exactly who he was meant to be, and he was loved for it. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all, not defeating his enemies or proving his worth to those who had rejected him, but simply learning to love himself enough to accept the love of others. It was a lesson worth learning, a story worth telling, a life worth living. The Omega who had once been nothing had become everything, not through strength or dominance or traditional measures of worth, but through the simple courage to remain open to love, even after being hurt. It was a reminder that sometimes our greatest weaknesses become our greatest strengths, that sometimes what others see as brokenness is actually the place where light gets in. In a world that often valued power over compassion, strength over sensitivity, conformity over authenticity, Linn and his family stood as living proof that there was another way. They showed that love could indeed conquer fear, that acceptance could triumph over prejudice, that families of choice could be just as strong as families of blood. And as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, as the moon waxed and waned through its eternal cycle, as seasons turned and years passed, their love remained constant, a beacon of hope for all who had ever felt rejected, abandoned, or lost. They had found each other in the darkness and created their own light, and that light would continue to shine for as long as hearts could love and souls could dream of better things. This is their story, a story of rejection transformed into acceptance, of weakness revealed as strength, of an ending that became a beginning. It's a story that reminds us that sometimes the greatest journeys start with the deepest pain, and that sometimes the family we choose is more precious than the one we're born into. Most of all, it's a story about the transformative power of love. Not the desperate, clinging kind that seeks to possess, but the generous, nurturing kind that seeks to heal. It's a love that sees potential where others see only problems, that finds beauty in brokenness, that creates home wherever it settles. And they all lived not necessarily happily ever after, but fully ever after, with all the messy, complicated, beautiful reality that comes with choosing love over fear, again and again, day after day, for as long as they drew breath in this world or any other. For in the end, that's what real love is, not a fairy tale ending, but a daily choice to keep choosing each other, to keep building something beautiful together, to keep believing that tomorrow can be better than today if we have the courage to make it so. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all. But their story was far from over. As word of the sanctuary they had created spread throughout the supernatural world, more and more beings began to find their way to the fortress of Ister. Each arrival brought new challenges, new opportunities for growth, and new lessons about the complexities of love and acceptance. 3 years after the confrontation with Kale's pack, Linn found himself standing in what had once been the fortress's empty east wing, now converted into a series of comfortable living quarters. The sound of laughter and conversation drifted through the corridors as their extended family went about their daily routines. There were nearly 30 residents now, representing a dozen different supernatural species, each with their own story of rejection and redemption. "Sometimes I can hardly believe how much has changed," Linn said to Valmaris as they watched a group of young shapeshifters playing in the garden below. Among them was Ruaw, now 10 years old and serving as a natural leader among the children, his mixed heritage allowing him to communicate with beings from all backgrounds. "Change is the one constant in this world," Valmaris replied, slipping his arms around Linn's waist from behind. "Though I admit, I never expected to go from hermit to patriarch of an extended supernatural family in the span of a few years." "Do you regret it?" Linn asked, though he already knew the answer from the contentment he could feel radiating from his mate. "Never," Valmaris said firmly, "though I do sometimes miss the quiet evenings when it was just the three of us." As if summoned by their conversation, Ruaw bounded through the doorway, his young face flushed with excitement. Papa Valmaris, you have to come see. Kira's showing everyone her new transformation, and it's incredible." Kira was their newest resident, a young dragon shifter who had been cast out from her clan for her inability to take a full dragon form. Instead, she could only manage a partial transformation, sprouting wings and scales but retaining her humanoid shape. Her family had seen this as a shameful weakness, but at the fortress, it was simply another variation of the beautiful diversity that made their community strong. They followed Ruaw down to the main courtyard, where a crowd had gathered around a slender young woman with iridescent blue-green scales covering her arms and delicate wings folded against her back. She was demonstrating how her partial transformation actually gave her advantages in combat that full dragons lacked: greater maneuverability, the ability to use weapons while flying, and a smaller target profile. "Incredible," breathed Marcus, the former Void Walker who had become one of their most trusted advisors on interrealm politics. "I've never seen anything like it. The clan elders who cast you out were fools to dismiss such unique abilities." Kira beamed at the praise, her confidence growing with each word of encouragement. This was what they had built here, a place where differences were celebrated rather than condemned, where unique abilities were nurtured rather than suppressed. "We should document this," Linn said, making a mental note to add Kira's combat techniques to the growing archive they maintained of supernatural abilities and knowledge. "Future generations should know that there are as many ways to be a dragon as there are dragons in the world." It was this commitment to preserving and sharing knowledge that had led to their next major development. The fortress library, once Valmaris's private domain, had grown into something resembling a supernatural university. Beings from across the realm came not just seeking sanctuary, but seeking education about cultures and abilities different from their own. We've received another formal request, Valmaris announced that evening as their core family gathered for dinner. The Northern Fairy Courts want to send a delegation to study our integration methods. Apparently, they're having their own struggles with outcasts and want to learn from our example. That's wonderful news, Linn said, though he could feel Valmaris's mixed emotions about the increased attention their community was receiving. What concerns you about it? Valmaris was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I worry that we're becoming too visible, too influential. There are those in various supernatural communities who see what we've built as a threat to traditional hierarchies. Not everyone is as enlightened as we might hope. His concerns proved prophetic sooner than any of them expected. It was Ruaw who first sensed the danger approaching, his mixed heritage giving him access to sensory abilities that even full-blooded werewolves lacked. Something's coming, he said one morning as they shared breakfast. Something big and angry, still far away but getting closer. It feels like a storm made of hate. Linn immediately reached out with his empathic abilities, extending his range as far as possible. What he found made his blood run cold. A massive force was indeed approaching, not just one pack or clan, but a coalition of traditionalists from multiple supernatural species, united in their determination to destroy what they saw as an abomination against the natural order. How many? Valmaris asked, already shifting into tactical mode. Hundreds, Linn replied grimly. Werewolf packs, vampire covens, fairy courts, even some dragon clans. They're calling themselves the Purest Alliance, and they believe our community represents a corruption that must be cleansed from the world. The news sent shockwaves through the fortress. Many of their residents had come here precisely to escape the kind of rigid thinking that the Alliance represented. The idea that their haven might be destroyed, that they might be scattered to the winds once again, was almost too painful to contemplate. We could evacuate, suggested Elena, a half-elf healer who had become Linn's closest assistant, scatter and regroup elsewhere, and abandon everything we've built? Marcus countered. Let them destroy the first truly integrated supernatural community in recorded history? That would be letting fear win over love. But we can't fight hundreds of trained warriors, protested Jeremiah, a young werewolf who had been cast out for his inability to shift into wolf form. We're mostly outcasts and refugees. We're not an army. No, Linn said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of leadership and hard-won wisdom. We're not an army. We're something much more powerful than that. We're a family. Over the following weeks, as the Purest Alliance drew closer to their borders, the fortress became a hive of activity. But instead of preparing for war, they were preparing for something far more ambitious, a demonstration of the very principles they had been built upon. We're not going to fight them, Linn announced to the assembled community. We're going to show them. Show them what? Asked David, a young vampire who had been exiled for his refusal to feed on unwilling victims. Everything, Valmaris replied, understanding immediately what his mate had in mind. We're going to show them what we've built, what we've achieved, what's possible when beings choose cooperation over conflict. The plan they developed was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of meeting the Alliance with weapons and defensive magic, they would greet them with open doors and open hearts. Every resident of the fortress would participate in demonstrating their daily lives, their achievements, their happiness. They would make it impossible for the attackers to see them as monsters or abominations. They would be forced to confront them as individuals, as families, as people. It's incredibly dangerous, Valmaris admitted during one of their planning sessions. If it goes wrong, if we can't reach them, then we'll face whatever comes together, Linn replied. But I have to believe that most of these beings aren't truly evil. They're afraid, they're clinging to old ways because change is frightening. If we can show them that there's nothing to fear, that what we've built makes the world stronger rather than weaker, then maybe we can change their minds instead of having to change their alliance's trajectory through force, Marcus finished. It's exactly the kind of impossible thing that you specialize in making possible. Ruaw, now old enough to understand the gravity of the situation, made his own contribution to their preparations. "I want to speak to them," he said, "not as your son, but as someone who represents what our community creates. I'm living proof that hybrid heritage isn't a weakness, it's a source of strength." "Absolutely not," Linn said immediately. "It's too dangerous. If something goes wrong, if something goes wrong, I want to be standing with my family," Ruaw interrupted, his young voice carrying a determination that reminded both his fathers of themselves at crucial moments in their own lives. "You taught me that courage means doing the right thing even when you're scared. Well, I'm scared, but I know this is right." The Purist Alliance arrived on a gray autumn morning, their numbers so vast that they seemed to darken the very sky. Linn stood on the fortress walls with Valmaris and Ruaw, watching as hundreds of supernatural beings arranged themselves in battle formation across the valley below. At their head rode a figure he recognized, an ancient vampire lord named Sebastian, renowned for his rigid adherence to traditional hierarchies and his belief that mixing between species was an affront to the natural order. "Fortress of Ister," Sebastian's voice boomed across the distance, magically amplified to reach every ear. "You have been found guilty of crimes against the natural order. You harbor abominations, promote unnatural unions, and corrupt the pure bloodlines that have maintained stability for millennia. Surrender now, and your deaths will be swift." Instead of responding with defiance or fear, Linn simply opened the fortress gates wide. What the Alliance saw next must have been unlike anything they had expected. Instead of warriors preparing for battle, they saw families going about their daily routines. Children playing in the garden, couples walking hand in hand, scholars sharing knowledge across species lines, healers tending to the sick regardless of their heritage. "We invite you to see what we have built," Linn called out, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "We invite you to witness what becomes possible when beings choose love over fear, cooperation over conflict, acceptance over prejudice." What followed was perhaps the strangest siege in supernatural history. Instead of attacking, the Alliance found themselves drawn into the fortress by their own curiosity. Small groups began to separate from the main force, approaching the open gates with a mixture of suspicion and wonder. The first breakthrough came when a young werewolf from one of the attacking packs recognized Jeremiah, the wolf who couldn't shift. Instead of the broken, shameful figure they had expected to find, they discovered a confident young man who had learned to use his human form as an advantage, developing fighting techniques and magical abilities that traditional werewolves couldn't match. "Jeremy?" the visiting wolf called out uncertainly. "Is that really you?" "It's me," Jeremiah replied with a smile that radiated genuine happiness. "Though I go by Jeremiah now. It's good to see you, cousin." The reunion that followed was emotional and powerful, two family members reconnecting across the divide of expectation and reality. Other Alliance members watched as the werewolf they had expected to find beaten down and miserable was instead surrounded by friends from a dozen different species, all of whom clearly valued him for who he was rather than what he couldn't do. Similar scenes played out across the fortress as the day progressed. Alliance members found themselves in conversations with beings they had come to destroy, only to discover complex, thoughtful individuals with rich inner lives and meaningful relationships. A vampire coven leader found herself deep in discussion with Marcus about the philosophical implications of redemption and second chances. A dragon clan elder was amazed by Kira's innovative combat techniques and her integration of dragon abilities with other magical traditions. But it was Ruaw's presentation that truly captured their attention. Standing before a gathering that included some of the most powerful supernatural beings in existence, the 10-year-old spoke with a poise and wisdom that belied his age. "You see me as an abomination," he began, his young voice clear and strong. "A mixing of bloodlines that shouldn't exist. But I am living proof that strength comes from diversity, that new combinations can create abilities that pure bloodlines never could. I can speak to the spirits of the forest like my werewolf heritage allows, but I can also walk in shadows like the vampire abilities my Papa Valmaris taught me. I can heal with the empathic gifts I learned from my Papa Linn, and I can see connections between realms that even ancient beings miss." He paused, looking directly at Sebastian. "You're afraid that mixing bloodlines will weaken your species. But what if it makes us all stronger? What if the future isn't about maintaining separation, but about learning from each other? The silence that followed was profound. Here was a child who embodied everything the Alliance claimed to oppose, yet who spoke with more wisdom and insight than many of their most revered elders. The cognitive dissonance was visible on faces throughout the crowd. How could something they had been taught to see as wrong produce results that were so clearly right? The boy speaks with silver tongue, Sebastian said finally. But pretty words cannot disguise the fundamental truth. Mixing of bloodlines leads to chaos, to the breakdown of the order that has kept our species strong for millennia. Has it kept us strong? Linn asked, stepping forward to join his son. Or has it kept us isolated, suspicious of each other, missing opportunities for growth and learning? Look around you. Look at what we've built here. Is this chaos, or is this harmony? To drive home his point, Linn reached out with his empathic abilities, but instead of projecting his own emotions, he shared what he could sense from the Alliance members themselves. Beneath their stated convictions, he found doubt, curiosity, and in many cases, a deep loneliness that came from lives lived within rigid boundaries that prohibited meaningful connections with anyone outside their own species. "This is what you feel," he said gently, his voice carrying the emotional truth to every mind present. "This is the isolation your pure bloodlines have given you. This is the loneliness that comes from believing you can only truly connect with beings exactly like yourselves." The effect was immediate and devastating. Alliance members found themselves confronting feelings they had buried for centuries, acknowledging needs they had never dared to express. Some began to weep openly as they realized what they had been missing, what their rigid adherence to tradition had cost them. But Sebastian was not so easily swayed. "Emotion is not logic," he declared, though his voice lacked its former certainty. "Feeling lonely does not justify abandoning the principles that have kept our species separate and strong." "Then let me show you logic," Valmaris said, stepping forward with an armload of books and scrolls. "Let me show you the research we've conducted, the innovations we've achieved, the problems we've solved by bringing different perspectives together." What followed was an impromptu symposium that lasted well into the evening. Valmaris and other residents of the fortress presented their findings on everything from cross-species healing techniques to new forms of magic that drew on multiple traditions. They demonstrated how dragon fire could be combined with fairy glamour to create illusions of unprecedented complexity, how werewolf pack bonds could be adapted to create support networks for beings with no natural family structure, how vampire longevity could be used to preserve and share knowledge across generations. "Impossible," breathed a fairy court elder as she watched a demonstration of elemental magic that incorporated techniques from 4 different magical traditions. "This should be chaos, conflict between opposing forces. It is when you approach it with the assumption that differences must lead to conflict," Elena explained patiently. "But when you approach it with the assumption that differences can complement each other, you discover harmonies that pure traditions never could achieve." As night fell and the demonstrations concluded, the Alliance found themselves in a position they had never expected. They were genuinely impressed by what they had seen. The fortress wasn't the chaotic abomination they had been led to expect, but a thriving community that had achieved innovations and insights that none of their separate societies had managed alone. "You have built something remarkable," Sebastian admitted reluctantly. "But exceptions do not disprove rules. Perhaps your small community can make these mixed relationships work, but that does not mean they would work on a larger scale." "Then why not find out?" Ruah asked with the straightforward logic that only children possess. "Why not try building communities like ours in other places? Why not see if what works here could work elsewhere too?" The suggestion sparked intense debate among the Alliance members. Some remained adamantly opposed to any deviation from traditional structures, but others had been genuinely moved by what they had witnessed. A schism began to develop within their ranks, between those who remained committed to the old ways and those who were beginning to see the possibility of something new. "I propose a trial," said Lady Morwen, an ancient fairy noble whose word carried significant weight among the assembled beings. "Let those who wish to explore these new ways of living do so, while those who prefer traditional structures remain free to maintain them. After a generation, we can assess the results and determine which approach produces stronger, happier communities. It was a compromise that satisfied neither the hardline traditionalists nor the progressive reformers, but it offered a path forward that didn't require immediate destruction or complete transformation. Over the following days, negotiations continued as the details of this unprecedented agreement were worked out. In the end, nearly a third of the alliance members chose to remain at the fortress or to return to their home territories with plans to establish similar integrated communities. These beings had seen something in the fortress that spoke to deep needs they hadn't even realized they possessed: the need for connection across difference, the need for acceptance of their complete selves, the need for communities built on choice rather than mere circumstance of birth. Among those who chose to stay was a young dragon named Thane, whose inability to breathe fire had made him an object of shame within his clan. At the fortress, he discovered that his unique biology actually made him an ideal intermediary for negotiations between fire-based and ice-based magical traditions. "I spent my whole life thinking I was broken," he told Linn during one of their evening conversations. "But here, I'm exactly what was needed. I can work with ice magic without being harmed by it, but I still understand dragon culture and traditions. I'm not a failed dragon. I'm a bridge between worlds." There was also Lydia, a werewolf alpha whose pack had rejected her leadership because she prioritized negotiation over dominance. She found herself fascinated by the fortress's consensus-based decision-making processes and began developing new models of leadership that incorporated the best aspects of both werewolf and vampire governing traditions. But perhaps the most surprising convert was Lord Sebastian himself. The ancient vampire who had led the alliance against them requested a private meeting with Linn and Valmaris on the eve of his departure. "I want you to know," he said, his formal manner barely concealing deeper emotions, "that what I have seen here has challenged every assumption I have held for over a millennium. I am not ready to abandon the old ways. They have served my people well for too long to be discarded lightly, but I am no longer certain they are the only ways." "That's all we ever hoped for," Linn replied. "Not immediate conversion, but willingness to consider that there might be other possibilities." "I have a request," Sebastian continued. "My youngest progeny, a vampire named Dorian, has always struggled with our traditional expectations. He questions our customs, shows inappropriate compassion for beings he should see as inferior, demonstrates what our laws would consider weakness. I had planned to have him destroyed for the good of our bloodline's purity." Valmaris's eyes sharpened at the casual mention of planned murder. "And now I wonder if perhaps the fault lies not with him, but with my inability to see strength in forms I don't recognize. Would you consider accepting him here? Not as exile or punishment, but as educational exchange." It was a remarkable request, representing a fundamental shift in thinking from one of the most traditional supernatural leaders in existence. The idea that a vampire lord would voluntarily send his progeny to learn from beings he had recently considered abominations showed just how profound the fortress's impact had been. "We would be honored to welcome him," Linn said, "and honored by the trust you're showing in us." "The honor is mine," Sebastian replied with a formal bow that somehow managed to convey genuine respect. "You have shown me that there are more ways to be strong than I ever imagined." As the alliance members departed, the fortress found itself fundamentally changed once again. Their community had grown not just in numbers but in complexity, incorporating beings from nearly every major supernatural tradition. The challenges of integration were immense, but so were the opportunities for growth and learning. "We're going to need to expand again," Valmaris observed as they watched the last of the departing alliance members disappear into the forest. "And we're going to need new governance structures to handle this level of diversity." "Growing pains," Linn agreed, "but good growing pains. The kind that come from success rather than failure." Ruaw, now taller and beginning to show the first signs of approaching adolescence, listened to their planning with the serious attention of someone who understood that he would inherit responsibility for this community someday. "What if we're wrong?" he asked suddenly. "What if mixing all these different traditions really does lead to chaos eventually?" It was a fair question, one that even Linn sometimes wondered about in the quiet hours before dawn. Building an integrated supernatural community was an experiment on a scale that had never been attempted before. There were no guidebooks, no precedents to follow, no guarantee that what worked in the short term would remain stable over decades or centuries. Then we learn, Valmaris said simply. We adapt, we modify our approach, we find new solutions to whatever problems arise. That's what families do. They face challenges together and find ways to overcome them. And if we fail completely, then at least we will have tried, Linn replied. At least we will have shown that it's possible to choose love over fear, acceptance over prejudice, growth over stagnation. Even if our specific community doesn't last forever, the ideas we're proving possible will outlive us all. But failure seemed increasingly unlikely as the months passed and their expanded community not only survived but thrived. The innovations in magic, governance, education, and social organization that emerged from their diverse population attracted attention from across the supernatural world. Delegations arrived regularly to study their methods, and new integrated communities began to spring up in other regions. The fortress itself underwent massive renovations to accommodate their growing population. The East Wing was expanded into a full residential complex. The library was transformed into a proper university with specialized schools for different magical traditions, and the gardens were expanded to include agricultural areas that could support their larger community. Sometimes I hardly recognize the place, Valmaris said one evening as they walked through corridors that had once been empty and silent but now bustled with activity at all hours. Do you miss the quiet? Linn asked. Sometimes, Valmaris admitted. But I wouldn't trade this for anything. We've created something that will outlast both of us. Something that will keep growing and changing long after we're gone. Their personal relationship had deepened and matured along with their community. The desperate, healing love of their early years together had evolved into something more stable and enduring. A partnership built on shared values, mutual respect, and the countless small intimacies that come from building a life together. I love you, Linn said suddenly, the words prompted by nothing more than the simple pleasure of watching his mate plan improvements to their shared home. I love you too, Valmaris replied, pulling him close. More than I ever thought it was possible to love anyone. They were interrupted by Ruaw, now 13 and full of the urgent concerns that came with adolescence. Papa Valmaris, we have a situation. The new dragon students are having territorial disputes with the werewolf pack bonds, and it's affecting everyone's sleep patterns. It was exactly the kind of complex, multi-species problem that their community faced regularly, and exactly the kind of challenge that kept life interesting. Together, the three of them headed off to mediate between young beings who were still learning how to navigate the complexities of integrated living. Just another day in paradise, Valmaris murmured with a smile that held no irony whatsoever. Exactly, Linn agreed, taking his mate's hand in one of his own and Ruaw's in the other. Exactly the kind of paradise we chose to build together. And so their story continued. Not with a dramatic ending, but with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, a love well shared, and a legacy well established. They had taken the pain of rejection and transformed it into the joy of acceptance, had taken the isolation of exile and transformed it into the warmth of chosen family, had taken the fear of difference and transformed it into the strength of diversity. Their fortress stood as proof that another way was possible, that beings could choose cooperation over conflict, love over hate, growth over stagnation. It wasn't perfect, no community ever is, but it was real, and it was working, and it offered hope to anyone who had ever felt rejected, abandoned, or lost. In the end, that was their greatest achievement. Not the magical innovations or the political breakthroughs or the social reforms, but the simple demonstration that love, given freely and received gratefully, could indeed change the world. One heart at a time, one relationship at a time, one community at a time, until the world itself became a more loving place. And that was a legacy worth leaving, a story worth telling, a life worth living, together, always together. For as long as love endured in their hearts and hope lived in their dreams.